What happens when the owner returns to his own restaurant and uncovers a scheme to bring down the kindest person working there? It was a typical weekday lunch at Rose's Kitchen. The clatter of silverware, the rush of a busy kitchen, and the quiet chime of the front door as it opened. No one paid attention to the man wearing an old baseball cap, a faded flannel shirt, and a face covered in 3 days' stubble. And that silence, that invisibility, was exactly what he wanted. Ethan Rowe, the founder, and once the very soul of this restaurant chain, had returned, not as the owner, but as an anonymous customer among the crowd. He stepped into the very first location, the one that had grown from a small roadside diner into a citywide brand. But now, all he could hear were whispers about staff quitting, profits slipping, and something slowly decaying from within. Ethan chose a seat near the bar, intentionally hidden behind a large wooden pillar. From there, he could watch every corner of this familiar space that now felt strangely unfamiliar. He ordered at random a ham sandwich and a black coffee. The server nodded, didn't smile, didn't ask questions. Everything moved as if no one cared anymore. Just another shift, another order, another cycle. Ethan took a sip of coffee, eyes fixed on the kitchen, where an older man was diligently washing a stack of dishes, handling them like fragile porcelain. Unlike the chaos around him, the old man, Hal Bennett, moved slowly but precisely, each motion calm and deliberate. On his forearm, a faint scar stretched from wrist to elbow, aged and faded like the solemn lines of his face. That scar made Ethan freeze. Something in him stirred, a memory of an old article written years ago about an unnamed man who had risked his life to save 3 children from a restaurant fire in the city's south side. A man who disappeared afterward, never accepted a reward, never left a name, only a distinctive scar. At the time, Ethan was just starting out, and he remembered reading that story in slants, filled with quiet admiration. And now, that same scar sat directly in front of him. As Ethan sat in thought, a harsh voice rang out from the front register. "Old Hal playing charity again? Guess he's trying to wash away his sins with dish soap." A mocking laugh followed from a young cashier named Crystal, sending a chill through the air. Next to her, a young man named Sean shook his head and muttered, "Heard the guy did time. Just look at him. Doesn't surprise me." Ethan clenched his coffee cup. He had come here to find out why revenue was falling, why the good ones were leaving, and why the mediocre ones stayed. But he didn't expect to find someone like Hal. Someone who might just be a hero, now shoved to the bottom of the coldest corner of the human heart. He knew he had to stay, to observe, to listen, and eventually to act. But first he had to be sure. Was Hal really the man from that story? Or just a tired old man with a messy past? And who had built the wall of indifference, now swallowing the very place that once represented his dream? No one in that restaurant knew that the man in the corner hadn't come just to eat a sandwich. He had come to uncover the truth and to save a soul the world had quietly forgotten. Midday dragged on beneath the pale, washed-out lights of Rose's Kitchen. Ethan remained seated at his usual table, the sandwich on his plate slowly going cold as his eyes followed every small movement in the space around him. Hal was still at the sink, diligently washing dishes, his back hunched with each breath, his hands trembling but never once dropping a single plate. He had no idea someone was watching him, not with the judgmental glance from the front register, but with the thoughtful, quiet focus of the man who had once built this place from the ground up. Crystal laughed as she handed change to a customer, then turned to Sean and made sure her words were loud enough to be heard. Old Hal nodded off behind the kitchen yesterday. If I were the manager, he'd have been let go a long time ago. Sean shrugged, speaking with zero effort to conceal his voice. Wouldn't be surprised. Heard the guy's been living in his car for years. Keeps asking for early paychecks to buy meds. Probably just an excuse to pocket some tip money. Ethan bit down on his lip, his chest tightening. He was the one who had written the company's founding commitment by hand. Rose Kitchen, where everyone is treated with respect. He had created the no-age discrimination policy himself, and yet now, in the very first branch he ever opened, they were mocking a man for being too dedicated and too poor. A young mother holding her child stepped up to the register. Her voice was soft, apologetic. Her credit card had just been declined. She fumbled through her wallet, the toddler beside her starting to cry. Crystal sighed, reaching for the cancel button, when Hal quietly appeared, hands still damp. Without a word, he pulled a few bills from the pocket of his wrinkled shirt and handed them straight to Crystal. "Consider it paid in advance," he said, then bent down to pick up a spoon that had fallen to the floor. The mother whispered a tearful thank you. But just a few seconds later, Sean muttered from behind the counter, "That's the third time this week. What, does he think he's some kind of priest?" Crystal burst out laughing. Or maybe he's trying to wash away his sins. Who knows? Maybe he really was a criminal. I mean, who ends up living in their car at that age? Ethan sat frozen. The truth was becoming painfully clear, and it was darker than he had imagined. This wasn't just neglect or casual ageism. It was cold, calculated cruelty. Hal wasn't just being excluded. He had become the butt of an ongoing joke, the target of a workplace culture where compassion was seen as weakness and empathy had been rebranded as something suspicious. Ethan knew that without solid proof, anyone who dared defend Hal would be swept into that same wave of ridicule. That's why he had to keep pretending, to keep observing as an outsider. And then, as if fate had written the moment itself, Hal suddenly paused, his hand pressed to his lower back, his face tightening with pain. But he didn't cry out, didn't groan. He just clenched his jaw, finished the last of the dishes, and quietly walked over to clean the table left behind by a customer. Ethan's grip tightened around his coffee cup, a powerful but quiet emotion rising in his chest. Pity alone doesn't change anything. Only the truth, brought fully into the light, could awaken a system this numb. But what Ethan didn't yet know was that what he would uncover tomorrow wouldn't just be about an old man named Hal. It would be the unraveling of a scheme born from the very place that once carried his name as a symbol. And this time, Ethan Rowe wasn't leaving with just a shake of the head. Late afternoon at Rowe's Kitchen, and the restaurant had finally settled down after the rush of the lunch crowd. Ethan sat quietly in his usual corner, his third cup of coffee long since gone cold. But he had no intention of leaving, not because of the food or some faded memory. He stayed because of the two faces huddled at the end of the counter, Crystal and Sean, still in their wrinkled aprons, eyes gleaming with quiet calculation. "Tomorrow's the day," Crystal whispered, her eyes darting around. "Let old Hal pull out his wallet one more time. Then I'll tell Patricia the register came up short, right when he was nearby. 3 strikes. That's all it takes to get him fired." Sean smirked, his voice flat and sharp. "More than enough. You do your part. I'll handle mine." Sean Jr.'s ready to jump in as soon as the spot opens. don't forget you get that $300 referral bonus, right? Crystal nodded. But it's got to be done within 3 days. Regional audit starts after that. Ethan sat frozen, his heart pounding against his chest. 3 days. That was the deadline to drive out a man who had lived for others, to be thrown out of the only place he still called home. But what stunned Ethan wasn't just the plan. It was the cruelty in their tone. They didn't just dislike Hal. They despised him. And they were ready to get rid of him like outdated inventory. Hal came into view, carrying a crate of vegetables from the back door. He nodded politely to a customer, a quiet habit of courtesy, then returned to the dishwashing area. Every movement was slow, but never sluggish. Ethan saw something Crystal and Sean never would. Dignity. Not the kind that comes from title or praise, but the kind that lives in people who never beg, never complain, and never blame. Suddenly, a soft ping came from Ethan's phone. He opened it, a system email from regional management. The subject line was cold and blunt. Notice of internal operations review at Rose number 1, 72 hours. Ethan smiled. They didn't know. The audit was something he had personally requested 3 weeks ago. But now, it wasn't just a review. It was Judgment Day. And he would make sure the one being accused would no longer be the kindest soul in this kitchen. He stood up, slipping away in silence, leaving behind the receipt with a single handwritten line. "I'll be back. And next time, nothing will be the same." The next morning, Ethan returned to Rose's kitchen earlier than usual, right in the quiet lull between 2 shifts. The sky outside hung heavy and grey, as if holding its breath, and the entire restaurant was bathed in a dim, cold light, reflecting off the faded signage. He kept his disguise, the flannel shirt now carrying a bit more dust, the cap pulled slightly lower, just enough to hide the growing sharpness in his eyes. He sat in his usual spot, trying to appear indifferent, but his mind was scanning every movement across the room. Crystal was there. Sean, too. Hal was mopping the kitchen floor, each step leaving a faint, dry squeak from his worn-out shoes on the tiles. Not even 10 minutes had passed when a new employee approached his table. A young woman, hair tied neatly, deep brown eyes holding something that made Ethan pause. Her name tag read, Ava. She placed a pot of coffee in front of him and offered a brief, polite smile. But in a fleeting moment when no one was watching, she slid a folded piece of paper beneath the napkin. Then she walked away, saying nothing more. Ethan opened the note under the table. The handwriting was rough but legible, written in blue ink. "They're watching. Don't trust Patricia. She owes Crystal for something in the past. A." Ethan froze. Patricia, the shift manager. The woman he had personally interviewed 2 years ago. Once one of the most promising candidates in the group. And now, somehow, she was part of this? Was she complicit? Or was she being forced? He looked up and saw Patricia stepping out of the small back office, clipboard in hand, her eyes passing over Hal without stopping, as if he were just part of the background. Crystal approached her, leaning in to whisper something. Patricia didn't respond, but her gaze quietly shifted toward the register, where the cash drawer was left slightly ajar. Ethan said nothing. He knew time was ticking toward the final hour. Just 2 days left until the internal audit began. He had to bring the truth into the light before then. But one thing was already clear. He couldn't do this alone. And maybe Ava, the one who slipped him the note, was the first doorway to uncovering that truth. Hal was quietly washing his hands after the morning rush. Ethan stood, heading toward the door. But just before leaving the restaurant, he caught a glimpse in the glass. Reflected in the faint morning light were 3 faces. Hal, hunched and weathered. Crystal, smirking. And Patricia, watching him. Not with the eyes of a manager keeping tabs on a customer, but with the look of someone who knows they're about to be exposed. Ethan clenched the note in his hand. This was no longer about lazy employees stealing tips. It had become a maze, where trust could lead to traps and lies could hide behind the mask of responsibility. The next morning, at exactly 9:15, Ethan arrived at Rose's kitchen. There were no more worn-out clothes or hats to hide his face. He wore a white button-down shirt, no tie, walked with a straight back, and his eyes, calm, but no longer concealing anything. The staff inside froze for a split second when he entered, then quickly resumed their work as if nothing had happened. Hal was wiping down the counter. Patricia had just stepped out of the office, clipboard in hand like every other day, though her expression looked slightly tense. Crystal was counting cash, Sean sitting close beside her, occasionally glancing up at the fake security camera on the ceiling, the one they thought didn't work. Ethan sat down at his usual corner table. This time, he didn't order anything. Ava appeared after a few minutes, but she didn't bring coffee. She simply gave him a small, subtle nod, a silent confirmation. Everything was in place. At exactly 10 o'clock, the front door opened. 2 men in grey suits walked in, name tags clearly showing they were from internal audit. Behind them was an IT technician, wheeling in a small equipment case. Crystal raised an eyebrow. Sean instinctively turned to walk away, but Patricia stepped forward awkwardly. "Excuse me, what's going on?" Ethan stood, calm but firm. "What's going on?" he repeated, removing his glasses and looking each person straight in the eye. "We're all about to find out." The air in the restaurant froze. Ava moved quickly, connecting a small projector to the promotional screen mounted behind the bar. With a single tap, the room dropped into silence as the footage appeared. Hidden camera video recorded 3 days earlier. Crystal was seen taking cash from a customer and slipping it into her own pocket, followed by a mocking line. "Hal's tips, I'll share a few imaginary bucks with him later." Sean was caught voiding orders. In another clip, Sean and Crystal fist-bumped after saying, "One more time, and Hal's out for good." Patricia's mouth dropped open. She turned to look at Crystal and Sean, her expression a mix of shock and fear. Sean jumped to his feet, stammering, This is edited. It's fake." But Ethan had already stepped forward, pulling a stack of papers from his jacket. System transaction logs, timestamps on voided orders, register discrepancies, all matching the events in the footage. "And this," Ethan said, pulling out a photograph, "is Hal Bennett during the 2004 restaurant fire. The man who saved 3 children, one of them the daughter of our very first strategic investor. The scar on his arm is proof of that act." The entire restaurant went silent. Hal stood in the back by the kitchen sink, tears welling in his eyes but his posture steady. He had no idea he had been watched. No idea that an ordinary day like any other would become the moment his truth was finally revealed. And he, once ridiculed, was now the living proof of quiet patience and human dignity. Ethan turned to Patricia. "You knew," he said, not angry, just somber. "But you chose to look away." Patricia nodded, voice trembling. "Hal caught me skimming a bonus last year. Crystal kept the proof. I was scared. Ethan sighed. I'm not firing you today, but you will step down from management. What you do next to make things right is your choice. He turned to Crystal and Sean. You two will leave immediately. Legal will be in touch with you first thing tomorrow. We have all the evidence we need. Then he looked toward Hal, who was still standing beside the sink, hands clenched, unsure what to do. Ethan walked over, extended his hand. Mr. Hal, I'd like to offer you a position as a senior advisor to our HR department. You have the honesty and empathy to teach what this company has forgotten. Hal didn't answer right away, but then he nodded, and he gently took Ethan's hand, hands still rough and calloused from years of quiet service. 1 week later, the original branch of Rose Kitchen held a special staff meeting. There were no flowers, no cake, only a newly mounted nameplate at the front counter. Honorary Advisor, Hal Bennett. Hal arrived in a worn but freshly pressed shirt, his face lighting up as he saw the new staff members bow their heads in a gesture of sincere respect. Ethan stepped up to the front, his voice soft but steady. What we need isn't just revenue. It's culture. And today, we begin again with one man. Someone who proved that quiet kindness is the most enduring foundation any system can have. Ava, now officially promoted to regional assistant, introduced a new initiative she had helped lead. Hal's Honor Fund, an emergency relief fund for employees quietly struggling with financial hardship. And as Hal stepped out of the meeting, he saw a new car parked just outside. Not luxurious, but solid and dependable. Alongside it was a single key and an address, a small apartment Ethan had leased for him long term, to replace the old vehicle where Hal had spent 3 winters sleeping alone. Ethan didn't need applause, but deep down, he knew that for the first time in many years, he had done what truly mattered, not just as an owner, but as a human being. In any organization, quiet kindness is often the strongest and most lasting foundation. Yet sometimes, it's people like Hal who are forgotten, even targeted. This story isn't just about an old man washing dishes or a boss in disguise. It's a powerful reminder that a person's true value doesn't lie in their title, but in how they choose to live, even when no one is watching. If you also believe that kindness is worth protecting, don't forget to hit like and subscribe to help share more stories that matter. And leave a comment with the words, "Choose what's right," so we know you still believe in decency.